half of Americans believe we're in a recession right now, despite a growing economy and low unemployment. This disconnect between economic reality and public perception is what's called a psychological recession. Rising costs, inflation fears, and a cautious mindset are making people spend and invest less, impacting the economy even though the data says otherwise. Today, we're diving into why so many people feel financially strained and what this means for the future. Because believe it or not, the psychological recession has arrived, and it could in fact be worse than an actual real recession. But before we get into it, my name is Nolan Matthias, and if you want the truth, the real truth about personal finance, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss about the psychological recession that has begun. But before we do, I have to say a special thank you to EvoToodles7553, who sent me a super thanks all the way from New Zealand. So thank you very much for that. So let's start by discussing the disconnect between economic indicators and public perception. Because when it comes to a psychological recession, a lot of times the truth is that there isn't actually a recession, even though people feel as though that is what is happening right at this moment. And in order to understand a psychological recession, it's when people, because of very recent past experiences, like the pandemic, start to believe that things are worse than they actually are. And a lot of this comes from, well, the fact that things are getting more expensive. And it seems like your money just doesn't go as far as it used to. And then, of course, there's the political side of this conversation, where politicians will have you believe that the previous administration or the future administration is going to absolutely destroy the economy, and that's going to make your life significantly worse than what it is right now. Well, the truth is that politicians have very little effect over the overall economy. And more specifically, the president of the United States doesn't actually have as much effect over the economy as many people believe. So that's very much a non-issue, but it doesn't mean that people don't start to believe that it is in fact going to be an issue. And this is where you have to take a look at public sentiment versus the economic realities, because right now many people believe that we're actually in a recession. In fact, 56% of people believe that we're in a recession, even though all of the data, which I'll show you in a minute, shows that we are totally not. For example, when you take a look at GDP growth, which technically a recession is when you have 2 quarters in a row of negative GDP growth, well, we're nowhere close to that, even though people are screaming, even in the comments of my videos, that yes, we are in fact in a recession, but it's simply not the truth. And when you look at the stats, 56 of Americans, at least in August of 2024, believe that we were in a recession. And the influence of inflation and higher interest rates have a lot to do with this. Obviously, inflation for the last couple of years was at all-time highs, although it has come back down pretty much close to normal, and we're seeing the Fed act accordingly, with interest rates being reduced. But even though things from an economic perspective are actually not that bad, it still costs more to buy meat at the grocery store, and it still costs more for your mortgage payments, and it still costs more for rent, which has many people believing that we must be in a recession because what I remember the prices of things being 2 or 3 years ago isn't what they are today. And as a result, spending and investment, well, they start to go down. And they go down significantly. And ultimately, the fear here is that this negative perception of what's actually happening in the economy could in fact lead to a future recession, which is why a psychological recession can become so dangerous. But in order to understand what's really going on here, we really have to understand the psychology behind a psychological recession. So this is where there's a divergence of public perception from the economic data. Oh, I think things are bad, inflation's high, things cost more, everything is getting worse, but the economic data shows the opposite. But the behaviors of the typical consumer, they start to mimic the behaviors that would typically happen during an actual real recession. Now, this can be a good thing for people. You spend less, you're more conscious about your money, but at the end of the day, that also has a negative impact on the economy because as people spend less, that leads to less GDP growth and ultimately can in fact induce an actual recession. And when you look at the factors in the United States that lead to this belief that there is a recession, there's of course that impact of inflation on household budgets, which obviously when you go to the grocery store and you see that that piece of steak that used to cost you $10 is now costing you 20, that has a pretty significant psychological impact, even though your income may have risen over the last couple of years. And then when you have higher interest rates and higher cost of living pressures, and the monthly budget is significantly higher than what it was 3 or 4 years ago, and maybe you don't feel like you've got the extra money to actually pay for it, well, of course, that's going to create some psychological issues as well. But here's the big one. Leading into this election that just happened, the political influence on the economic perception was at an all-time high. We had both the Democrats screaming about the fact that Donald Trump would in fact lead to a very bad economy in the future, which, by the way, probably isn't what's actually going to happen. And we also had Donald Trump screaming about the Democrats and how poor of a job that they did with the economy, which actually isn't really the case either. Because when it comes to US politics, the one thing that stands tried and true is that there are checks and balances in place, and that no one person can actually be the major problem or the major savior of the economy. But where this gets really scary is that when people start to believe the rhetoric. And there's no greater example of this than what happened in 2008, when in 2009, early 2009, technically, the recession ended, but it took almost a full year after that for the consumer confidence actually to come back up, for people to actually believe that the recession was over. And the problem with this is that it leads good people to make bad decisions as a result of fear. Take, for example, gold. So this is a chart that shows consumer confidence. Obviously, it was quite high in 2007, and it came down drastically in 2008. But after the recession was over in 2009, which you can see clearly here, consumer confidence started to go up. However, there was still that psychological recession for many people. Not everyone believed that the recession was over. And it had people doing crazy things like going and putting their life savings into gold, even though in theory all the damage that could have been done had already been done. And you can actually see here that even though consumer confidence was coming back up, people were still rushing to gold because they believed that it was the thing that they needed to invest in order to hedge against economic collapse. But ironically, what allowed people to be able to buy the amount of gold that they did was the fact that the economy was not as bad as they believed it was. They actually had the additional income and the additional disposable cash to be able to go and hoard their gold. And this is pretty much true of every major recession. Typically, the prices of gold only go up a little bit during the recession, but tend to go up for a series of years after a recession, primarily because people do not believe that the worst is over. And that's where economic sentiment versus reality comes into play. Because really what we need to be paying attention to is not the news articles and the politicians and the feelings we have, but the real economic data, the technical indicators of how the economy is actually functioning. Because when you take a look at US GDP and employment rates, well, they're a lot better than many people would believe they were if they didn't look at the actual data. And I'll show you these numbers in a second. But this is the difference between a technical and a psychological recession. In a technical recession, we have the data points to prove that we are actually in a recession. But in a psychological one, people just believe that things are bad, even though things are actually not as bad as they believe. And a lot of this really comes down to that household financial strain that happens even though the indicators are strong, people are employed, and well, there's enough money to go around. And if you take a look at the GDP numbers, for example, as of right now, you can see that the criteria of 2 negative quarters of growth of GDP has not been met. In fact, in 2022, we had 1 quarter where growth in GDP was negative. Ever since then, the growth in GDP has been quite strong. And when you take a look at unemployment rates, well, you can see that we're way below where the spikes in unemployment happen during a recession. So even though, yes, we're starting to see unemployment numbers come up, and the SAM rule and all the other things that people talk about with respect to a recession being imminent could be something to be worried about, the reality is the employment numbers, the unemployment numbers, to be more specific here, are not as bad as they have been in other times leading up to a recession. In fact, historically, they are well below average. And then we've got the financial pressures on households. 82% of US adults are stressed by inflation right now. And there's no doubt that they should be. Yes, the inflation numbers, so the rate at which prices are going up, has come down, but that doesn't mean that prices have come down. In fact, prices are still significantly higher than they have been in the past. But we're also entering a period of wage inflation, which means that our wages are about to catch up, or at least should catch up to the prices that have increased. And on top of that, we're starting to see things in different parts of the market where prices are coming down. For example, for the first time in almost 20 years, you can now get a $10,000 to $20,000 discount on a Jeep Wrangler. That hasn't happened in ages. But that 40-year high in inflation from 2022 had a serious psychological impact. But the key here is not to let that psychological impact affect your behavior in a way that is detrimental to your psychological and your financial health. So here's the thing. A lot of households, when there's a psychological recession, tend to reduce their investments because, hey, I don't have as much money to invest. And that makes sense. But that pullback can be detrimental to your financial growth. It can be detrimental to your future. So instead, what people need to be doing is focus on saving and reducing expenses so that they continue to make the investments that they need to make, especially in times where it seems as though the stock market is headed to the moon. So the mistake during a psychological recession is to pull back your investment dollars because you believe things are bad, instead of pulling back your spending and reducing your expenses and continuing to be able to invest. Because it is during these times where people think things are bad, where the stock market tends to perform really well. And if you've stopped investing, or worse, pulled money out of your investments to support your lifestyle, you're going to miss out on a significant amount of returns. And then, of course, there's the housing market strain. We can't ignore this. Rising mortgage rates affect homeowners, both from the perspective of the cost of owning a new home, but also from the perspective of the value of homes when there are less buyers available to buy the homes that are for sale. This is where demand doesn't meet supply, and as a result, we start to see prices go down. But at the same time, the rising mortgage rates and the rising costs lead renters to face climbing rental prices. And this is where it can get scary for the economy, because all of these rising prices for housing costs and everything else can cause discretionary spending to go down further. And this could eventually lead to an actual recession. So it's important that we take a look at the economic indicators. We need to examine the sentiment disconnect. So in other words, we need to look at what you're hearing in the news and what we're hearing from politicians and actually check the data to see if the rhetoric matches the data. So in other words, we need to look to see if the public's acting cautiously as if we're in a recession, but we actually aren't. So let's take a look at the outlook for 2024 and beyond. The thing you need to understand is that the future economic forecasts predict gradual improvements. Yes, there are some economic forecasts that suggest we could find ourselves in a recession in 2025 or 2026, but here's the reality. Economists do the best to make predictions based on the information that they have right now. And more often than not, those economists are wrong. There's a saying that goes, hey, you know what? There's a lot of economists that predicted 45 of the last 3 recessions because they have a tendency to look at the current data without the foresight or the insight into what is going to happen in the future, because obviously they don't have crystal balls, and that leads to inaccurate forecasting. So until we are actually in a recession, it makes sense not to act as though we're in a recession. Aside from the positive things like reducing our spending and saving more, we shouldn't be scared of our own shadows, so to speak. And it's important to note that it's anticipated that we're going to be able to control inflation in the future. It's come back down to where it should be. The Fed is starting to reduce interest rates, and barring any unforeseen crazy events, it should start to stabilize. And to operate as though the worst is going to happen will simply lead you to make really poor decisions like putting your life savings into gold. Because the reality is, things like the great melt-up and the reverse market crash of whenever are things that may or may not happen, but they're also not very likely to happen. In fact, more often than not, economies have positive results than they have negative ones. But it's important to note that there's potential for the sentiment to remain fragile. And if something bad happens, it could lead to catastrophic results. But it's also important to note that there's potential for the sentiment to get stronger. And as it gets stronger, like it did in 2010 and 2011, the economy will get better, things will get back to normal. And the question is, what are you going to do right now to take advantage of the time where everyone else is scared so that you can make profits for yourself and put yourself ahead of the game? Because when it comes to a psychological recession, there's a significant impact on consumer behavior. The cautious outlook of consumers is going to affect consumer spending, which means you're probably going to be able to get a deal on things that you haven't been able to get a deal on in the last couple of years. And it's also important to note that it's going to take time to rebuild financial confidence. The fear of recessions don't go away overnight. And if I think back to my time as a child and the conversations that I had with my grandparents, 50, 60, 70 years after the Great Depression ended, they were still afraid to have a mortgage, they were still afraid to have debt, and they were still afraid of the potential for the next big Great Depression. Because in some cases, the consumer confidence never completely returns. And if there were 2 or 3 things that I would be watching in the economy at any given time, it would be the GDP growth rate, it would be the unemployment rates, and it would be the consumer sentiment ratings. Because if you watch those 3 things, it gives you a pretty good feel for where the economy is going. And it allows you to get ahead and make your decisions ahead of the market, which I don't think I have to explain why, helps you get ahead of everybody else. So when it comes to this psychological recession that we're in right now, understand that there's going to be noise. There's going to be people, there's going to be politicians that say things are bad right now, and it's going to get worse. But what matters is that you don't fall into the psychological trap of believing the rhetoric, of believing that your own success is outside of your own control and just letting the news cycle act upon you rather than you acting upon what you know is true based on the data and giving yourself a leg up. Oh, and by the way, if you want to know what always actually happens before a financial crisis, make sure you check out this video right here.